Thank you very much. Back in the early 1980s, before Vicki Horwath was born, I used to cover international economic summit conferences, which still take place with the leaders of the major industrialized nations. And every year I would go to these, and they said there was a global financial crisis, and unless we solve it soon, life as we know it will end. So I'm not sure whether this is the same one, a continuation, or a different one, and we'll find out from our speakers tonight. Now, I have to set some ground rules. We have four very distinguished speakers. I'm not going to waste our time reading their bios. They're all in the program that you have. And we're going to give each of them 5 minutes to solve the global financial crisis, or at least tell us their perceptions of it. And followed by that, each of them will have 2 minutes to tell you why the others were all wet, or to expound further on their brilliance. And then we'll open up. I may ask them a question or two, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. And this is likely to be a very serious discussion, as it should be. But I want to start by relating a wonderful story I heard in Washington last week that is sort of bearing on this. The joke that's going around is that President Obama walks out of the White House one day, and one of the ancient tiles from the roof of the White House falls and hits him on the head, and he goes into a coma. And he wakes up a year later, it's March of 2012, and he panics because he realizes that Vice President Biden has been in charge for a year. So he rushes to his bedside and he says, Joe, what's the deficit now? And Biden says, the budget's balanced. He says, the budget's balanced? He says, what's the inflation rate? Biden said, I knew you would ask that. It's 1.1%. 1.1%. Obama says, well, what's unemployment? Biden says, 5%. 5%? He said, well, Joe, think, when you go to the store and buy a loaf of bread, what does it cost now? Biden says, 3 yuan. So, moving from the ridiculous to the sublime, at this point, we're going to begin with Dr. Harry Verizor. Is that correct?
Yes.
Sir, take it away, please. Okay. 5 minutes.
5 minutes. When I was first asked to present, they mentioned that I should mention what's going on in the economy today, and I'll let my other colleagues talk about the financial crisis. But there are two underlying themes, two underlying foundations or problems to what I see as a major problem. I hope it doesn't take the time. Major problems, and that is, the first one is the currency disorder ever since the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement, and the second one is the demographic problem. And in a sense, the demographic problem is driving all of the problems with regards to the collapse or the financial problems of the welfare state. Just talk about demographics for a minute. Most economists know that Japan is growing older, Europe is graying. The United States, at least our population is we're at replacement. We are the only major power that's at replacement. But the problem is that the baby boom now has come to an end, and now we have the baby bust as far as the support of all the Social Security, medical care, and these other systems. And this is driving the problem in Europe. It's driving the problem in Japan. It will drive the problem in China, because the Chinese have one child, and as you know, it takes two to tango. So we're saying that China is going to run into a significant problem with four grandparents, two parents, and one child. And this is going to be a significant problem. It will drive budgets around the world. It will cause enormous financial stress. The second problem is the currency disorder. And I don't know if you read the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, a number of people are coming out for the reinstitution of the gold standard. When I was known, when I taught as Gold Standard Harry, and people would laugh at it, but now the president of the World Bank, a number of other financial leaders are coming out and saying, yes, we have to restore the gold standard. Under the gold standard, all the currencies were linked together. So you linked your currency to gold, and then everything automatically fell into place. Today, we have, with the floating exchange rates, which were established after Bretton Woods, we have 100 plus currencies in the world, all fluctuating, and the US dollar is fluctuating. And here's what happens. Nations now adjust their currencies to increase exports and to decrease imports, and to keep jobs in their country. And this is leading to an awful lot of problems in the world economy. And it's become one of the major argument points at the economic conferences. The world leaders are sitting down and saying we have to either go to SDRs, we have to go back to gold, or we have to have some currency that's adjustable. Because you see what happens when you lower the value of your currencies, like the Chinese have.
1 minute.
Okay? You create a problem where you have an imbalance of exports and imports. And this leads to, of course, a demand for protectionism. So these are the major topics being discussed in the financial journals. I myself would be for reinstitution of the gold standard. And I think the currency, the demographic disorder, we have to adopt a policy that is much more friendly to having children.
Thank you. Gentlemen, could you all move your microphones slightly closer to you?
Closer.
I'm told that would help. Our next speaker is Dr. Hari Singh.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah. All right. My talk is going to be slightly different. We're going to talk about the U.S. and what we have to do in terms of trying to make sure that we are growing, we don't jeopardize this recovery, while at the same time we have to balance the long-term budget. So it's between a rock and a hard place. So and the solutions are not very easy. But let me start with this. Whenever you talk about a budget deficit, the deficit is a representation of the fact that most Americans want more services than they're willing to pay for. There are surveys done on this stuff. Most people will say, don't cut my benefit, cut the other guy's benefit, you know? So if there's any enemy down here, the enemy is us. You know, like Pogo said, we have seen the enemy and it's us. Maybe we think it's the other guy because the other guy gets the benefit and we do not, but no one wants his own benefits cut. That is for sure. The question really is, how do we make it sustainable in the long run, while at the same time investing in the foundations for our economic growth? These are things like basic R&D. Corporations don't invest in basic R&D, the kind of R&D which wins Nobel Prizes, the kind which becomes a foundation for corporate R&D and product-related R&D. Also in terms of education and infrastructure. So to make these investments, we have to do two things. Number one, and I think the question is really when we pivot from high deficits to trying to control the entitlements. So at least for the next 1 or 2 years, it's hard to reduce expenditure because basically we want to create the recovery ongoing, and there's going to be a substantial amount of reduction in state expenditures already. So if you start doing that at the federal level, that will be a definite drag in terms of the recovery. So for 1 or 2 years, we need to keep the current kind of expenditures roughly where they are at the federal level. But in the long run, we need a binding policy to reduce the big four. And the big four, if you look at the discretionary part of the budget, the part which the Republicans and the Democrats are fighting about up on the Hill, it's only about 12.5% of our total national budget. So it's about $460 billion out of a total budget of $3,700 billion. So almost $4 trillion. So the big four are really defense, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And there's a simple summary for this. The pain has to be spread around. It'll go on all the four. For Social Security, we should have fixed the system long time ago, but we can still fix it. The longer we delay, the more difficult the solutions will get.
1 minute.
You can basically fix it by increasing the retirement age, raising the cap in terms of the taxes on Social Security, and also in terms of reducing the benefit growth, just the growth, by 1 or 2% in the long run. Defense expenditure will have to go down significantly. I know that Secretary Gates has talked about reducing defense expenditure by about $60, $70 billion over 10 years. But it needs to go down much more significantly than that. He said something intelligent, though, a few days ago. He said that fighting a land war would be insane in the future. I thought it was insane in Iraq, where we spent $3 trillion in terms of the direct and indirect costs. But imagine the total overall expenditure on that. Medicare will also have to go down significantly, which means probably in the future, the richer guys who are retired will have to pay higher deductibles and co-payments. That's coming. Don't fool yourselves about that. And the largest expansion, the most dramatic expansion, It's going to happen in Medicaid.
Time, sorry. We now go to Dr. Gary Wolfram.
All right.
All right, well, I grew up in Fresno, California. My dad was a advised cattle rancher, so we try to fit things into a scheme of how do you do with cattle. And my view of what happened in the economy is you got a cow in the ditch. There's three things you got to do. One is you got to get the cow out of the ditch, figure out why the cow got in the ditch, and then keep the cow from getting in the ditch. So the first thing I want to talk about briefly is how the cow got in the ditch. Well, the cow got in the ditch because of basically the government provided all sorts of incentives for people to do what? To borrow and to buy housing. First of all, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac began buying mortgage-backed securities. Freddie Mac was the one that invented such things. They began buying mortgages from people that were, quote, underserved. In 1996, HUD required them to have 42% underserved, 50% by 2000, 56% by 2008. So what do you have? You have Countrywide making mortgages, and they don't care if you pay it back. They're going to sell it off to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So you created these wrong incentives. In addition to that, then you created an interest rate decrease from 6.53% in June of 2000 to 1% in July of 2003, held it there for 1% for a year, which encouraged people to borrow. And then what did you do? Well, they got worried about inflation. They start increasing interest rates. In July of 2004, it hits 5.25% in July of 2006. And what happened? Housing prices started to collapse. So we created a malinvestment in housing. And we created it because we encouraged all sorts of borrowing by keeping the interest rates low. And the only way you can get yield is to what? To leverage, right? And what's the best place to leverage? What's the easiest place to leverage? Housing. I can take $3,000 and buy a $300,000 house. If it goes to $306,000, then I've doubled my money on my $3,000. So you pushed all that in there. In fact, Secretary Geithner, you wonder how people are going to fix this thing. July 21st, he said, "We borrowed beyond our means, and the solution is measures to bring down the cost of borrowing." Well, you know, I'm not quite sure that's the right answer. So what else? Why is it such high unemployment? I mean, that's really the problem here. GDP is growing. It's unemployment that's the problem. I think the main reason you've got unemployment so high is you created what's called regime uncertainty, that Bob Higgs of Independent Institute calls that. What is that? I don't know what the rules of the game are going to be. And what are the big things that happen? Well, you have or cap and trade. You don't know if that's going to affect you. You don't know if it's going to affect your electricity bills, if you're Oasis Car Wash. Then we have the health care program, Obamacare, 2,800 pages long. What's that going to do? Should I hire somebody or not? So what do you find? You find that you got 9 million people employed part-time that want to be employed full-time. Then what we have is we compound that with financial regulation, another 2,700-page bill, so the local bank doesn't know if it can lend to the local small business because it doesn't know if it's going to comply with everything. So what did you do? You froze up credit. What's the solution been? Quantitative easing. We're going to create even more. What's going on is the Fed is buying the mortgage-backed securities that got created because it kept interest rates too low and pushed stuff into housing. And now then it pays the banks to keep excess reserves in order to keep there from having inflation. But the inflation is starting to get out. Right now there's over $1 trillion in excess reserves, which is unheard of. Used to be $2 billion. Why is that? Because the Fed's paying banks to keep excess reserves. So if those excess reserves start walking out into the economy, what are we going to get? Inflation. What are you getting right now? Inflation in food, inflation in commodities. And one of the reasons that you've got one of the reasons you have these problems in the Middle East is, why are these people all of a sudden rising up? They're all of a sudden rising up because food prices are going up. And and for us, corn going to $7 a bushel, that's not a big deal to us. But if food is 50% of your budget, then it's a big deal that corn is going up. So I think the solution to all this is simply to try to realize how economies work and say, why are we giving the Federal Reserve, as Harry basically pointed out, why are we giving the Federal Reserve the authority to set the price of loanable funds?
Thank you. Dr. Dan Giederman.
I want to start by saying that in the debate that is occurring in the public right now among politicians, it seems like it's always talking about the deficit. It's always talking about, is the national debt getting too large? And I think that's sort of the wrong goal to focus. I think what we need to focus on is how do we improve in a broad sense, the overall quality of life in the country. And sometimes this might mean that the government's going to do more. Sometimes it might mean that the government's going to do less. Now, when I heard that this meeting was going to be at Aquinas, I got a little bit scared because I knew there were going to be a couple things that might sound blasphemous when I said them. And the first thing that's blasphemous that I want to say is that we are not facing, as a nation, an immediate financial crisis. And when I say that, I mean a debt crisis for the country. This does not mean that we don't have problems in the long run. We do. There are certainly things that we have to work through in the long run to make sure that we're not going to have debt levels that are too high. But right now, these are not the problem. Right now, our debt levels are fine right now. And in terms of the politics of trying to slash spending right now to fix the problem, this is not the way to do it. We have a shaky recovery right now, and to just indiscriminately go in and slash the budget for the sake of saying we're government spending too much money, let's just cut it right now, it could make things worse. This is similar to what happened in 1937 when FDR said, okay, now we have to balance the budget. And what happened when they went in to balance the budget? Well, the Great Depression really turned into the Great Depression as we had the secondary downturn. So that's one thing I want to keep in mind. Something else I want to say is nobody is going to argue that most people are not going to argue the United States should abandon markets. Markets are one of the greatest tools for good and improvement and innovation and just economic increases in overall well-being that have ever occurred in the world have come from markets. But one thing I want to note is that there's sort of a distinction between markets and government. Typically we say that it's markets versus government. Is it the public sector versus the private sector? And I think this is a false dichotomy. It's a false competition because I think often the public sector can complement the private sector. And that's one thing I think we need to be very careful as we're trying to make decisions as we go forward. How are we going to make the proper public investments that can foster private investment which will then lead to growth? So I think we need to be very careful. Back in the 60s or 70s, or early 70s, we might have thought, well, the government is going to solve a lot of problems. We're all Keynesians now. We thought we could fix the economy. And that was disproved in the 1970s, but I think the pendulum was swung too far in the other direction of saying, the government is the problem. The government is not always the problem, and the government can do good things to improve overall growth that can help us address the long-run fiscal imbalances that we face. And I do want to point out that we do need investment. There was a report card issued a couple years ago by the American Society of Civil Engineers, and they graded the public infrastructure in the United States as a D. Things are needing to be maintained, and it's going to take money to do this. So this is the next thing I want to say, and this is the next blasphemous thing to say, is that in the United States, our taxes are too low. So wait for the murmur, but they actually are. For Harry Singh, Professor Singh mentioned that, in the United States, we want a lot of things. Okay, we want the government to provide many things. There was a survey that came out a few weeks ago by the Pew Forum, and it basically, the people said that, what should the government cut? And they went down the line. Should we cut health care? Should we cut defense? Should we cut unemployment aid? Should we cut all the education, university education? The answer was no. As a matter of fact, most people wanted us to increase spending. The only area where we didn't want to spend more, that we actually wanted to decrease spending, was in foreign aid. And foreign aid represents such a minuscule amount of the budget, we can completely eliminate it and basically extend Medicare for about another day and a half, perhaps. So this is one of the things that we're going to need to pay for what we want. And so we're going to have to increase taxes.
1 minute.
By a comparison, I just want to give a feeling for where we are in terms of taxes. Out of the OECD nations, out of the 34 OECD nations, the United States ranks 4th from the bottom in terms of tax revenue as a percent of GDP at 28.3%, which sounds fairly high, but if we compare ourselves to countries like Germany, Germany right now is the country everybody looks at and says, we'd like to be like Germany, they have strong growth, where their tax revenue as a percent of overall GDP is 36.2%, Canada is 33.3%, Switzerland 28.9%, and if we want to look at what countries are below us, what countries collect less, Turkey, Chile, and Mexico. So out of the developed nations, there's sort of a framework of, do we want to pay for what we hope to get? And the answer is, I think we're going to need to pay for. So that's something that we need to keep on the table, are higher tax revenues.
Well, thank you. Now we're going to go in the same order, and each panelist is going to have precisely 2 minutes to add further elucidation or to assault their colleagues, beginning with Dr. Verizon.
Well, thank you. I agree with my colleague on my right that there is going to have to be something done about the entitlement programs. That should have been taken care of a long time ago. The problem is politically it becomes almost impossible because neither party will let the other party do it. and they're going to be faced with the necessity of having to do that. How they're going to fix it is a whole different area we could debate. With Dr. At the end of the table, I forget his name, I don't know whether I'm getting Alzheimer's or not, but whatever, I'm older.
It's Partzheimer's.
Yeah, Partzheimer's. Anyway, I would ask him, I think he brought up a very important point about the relationship between government and business, and that is, I think people are beginning to understand that there's an interdependence. Remember, it's the success of business in your town that actually pays the salaries of the teachers, the firemen, the police, and everything else. And we're beginning to realize if those businesses aren't successful, they are not going to generate tax revenue. And when they do not generate tax revenue, you got what you have in almost 50 of the states. What has happened? The tax revenue has decreased. And so we have to have a very strong business community. Government can contribute to that. It can't make it. And business requires government. So there's an interdependence between the two of them. There is a point of diminishing returns on taxation. We found out, according to what's called Hauser's rule, 19% is about all the federal government's going to get out of us. After that, revenues start to decline. So taxes do have a point of diminishing returns. Americans will not pay the taxes because they won't invest or they'll try to get around it. I think that the housing problem is a result of the currency breakdown. This happened before in the 20s. This is an exact repeat of, in a lot of ways, the Federal Reserve then expanded the currency.
Unfortunately. Dr. Singh, 2 minutes.
Well, I think the discussion here is going in two lines. One is what to do about the current situation, and the other thing is what created all this mess. Let's not relitigate the past. If you want to see a good movie about this, the best documentary for last year, it's called Inside Job. And if you saw the Oscars last night, it was the Oscar winner. And basically, it's not kind on economists either, but there's plenty of brain to go around in terms of what caused the mess. But in terms of the future, let's focus on the future at least. I want to second a few points which Dan made. I think we are roughly on the same page. But one of the issues in terms of taxes is the rising income inequality. Let me give you a number. In 1982, the top 10% made 35% of all income. So the top 10% made 35% of all income. Now, the top 10% make 50% of all income. Now, if you increase taxes, obviously it's not very good for growth. But Bush Sr. and President Clinton raised taxes, and we had the longest peacetime recovery in the history of the United States between 1992 and 2001. Although taxes were, not that low compared to what we have in the last few years. So even if you go back to the regime during the Clinton years, that means we repeal all President Bush tax cuts. We were pretty good in terms of marginal rates, and the economic growth was quite good. So in fact, if we just do that, we just don't extend these tax cuts beyond the 2 years we have agreed to. The Congressional Budget Office shows that our budget deficit will become sustainable in about 3-4 years. It'll be about 3% of the GDP, and roughly if the growth is higher than that, then in the long run, the budget deficit starts shrinking. So we got to do two things. We got to decline entitlements, and we got to raise some taxes at the margin. I'll leave you with this question. Hopefully my 2 minutes are not up. So at the margin, what do you want to do in terms of either raising taxes or cutting Medicaid expenditure in states?
Time, unfortunately. We'll get back to this topic. Dr. Wolfram.
Well, let's talk a little bit about taxes. Think about this. How do you get wealthy in a market system, right? I can't force you to buy anything. Myers can't force you to buy something. You don't go to the Walmart and they start throwing stuff in your cart and make you buy it, right? The only way you get wealthy in a market economy is to produce something that somebody else wants, right? And so you produce something that somebody else wants and you get wealthy. But that takes a risk. You got to take a risk to do that. When Steve Jobs decided he was going to make the iPad or the iPhone, he didn't know you guys were going to like it. Then he was going to use up all these resources developing thing and selling it. So what do? I reward people if it works. If it doesn't work, guess what? They go out of business. So they take that risk. Now, do I want people to take that risk? I sure do, because 50% of what you're going to use today did not exist when I was born, in the year that I was born. So why do we get so much innovation? Because we reward people. If we tax people, these tax cuts on the rich aren't tax cuts for the existing rich. They're the tax cut for the kid that's sitting in Aquinas College or Grand Valley or Hillsdale College that's sitting there and is going to take that risk to become rich. And if they know that they're going to be taxed if they take that risk, they're not going to take so many risks, they're not going to innovate, and guess what? We're all going to be poor for it. I'd prefer a world where the richest guy has a gazillion billion dollars, because the only way he got a gazillion billion dollars is he made something really cool for me. I mean, think about this. How many people in this room have ever used something that was Microsoft related? Okay? Now, that's why Bill Gates is rich. Now, how many have ever paid to listen to me speak? That's why I'm not. Okay? So the tax cuts for the rich are there to do what? To encourage innovation and to create what? Wealth for the poor. All you guys have a computer or a cell phone or something else.
Time, unfortunately. Dr. Giederman gets the last word for now.
I'll start by saying taxes, it's true, we don't want to discourage people from working hard with taxes, but suppose you can't afford to go to college because your Pell Grant got cut because there isn't tax revenue coming in. You're not going to get very wealthy that way. Back to the idea, I'm an economic historian. Harry Singh wants to look at the future. I need to look at a little bit at the past, going back to the financial crisis. There were no government regulations that caused the investment banks to create synthetic collateralized debt obligations that were then traded. There were no government regulations that caused sort of an incestuous relationship between the credit rating agencies and the issuers of mortgage-backed securities and, as I said, collateralized debt obligations, which are sort of mortgage-backed securities on heroin. So these are things. So I think to kind of blame the overall financial crisis on government regulations just really doesn't make sense, especially if you see, well, if it happened in the United States, it was government regulations. Freddie and Fannie, they weren't making loans to people to buy homes in Spain or in the UK, and they've suffered similar problems to what we've had. I also want to make the statement about regime uncertainty. There was some regime uncertainty, that's certainly the case, but there was a survey of firms a few months ago and said the overwhelming thing, the reason they're not hiring workers is because there's no demand for products. And so if there's no demand for products, we're not going to hire workers. If there was demand, they would deal with the uncertainty of what's going to happen with the regulations. So this is something we need to consider too. With respect to the idea of going back on the gold standard, I would encourage us to look and see how great was life under the gold standard. There's been some research, if you look at the research in going into the Great Depression, what made the Great Depression great wasn't just, balancing the budget in 1937, but it was also the unwillingness or the inability of central bankers to even imagine a world of not being on the gold standard. And the nations that went off the gold standard recovered more quickly during the Great Depression. And if we talk about, eliminating the Federal Reserve, which is sort of implied in the statements that were made earlier, look at the world before the Federal Reserve. Look at the United States.
Time, unfortunately. Now we get to do the part that's my favorite. I get to ask a couple questions before I turn it over to you. And I'm going to go in the reverse order, starting with Dr. Giederman on my right, not necessarily politically, all the way down to Dr. Singh on my far right. I'm a little surprised because this event was billed as a program on the global financial crisis, and all of your remarks have been almost exclusively domestic. So I'd like to begin by asking you, each of you, to take about a minute to address the question of how dependent and how intertwined is our economy with that of China's? Is that a good thing? And can we do anything about it? Beginning with you, Dr. Giederman.
Yeah, we're quite entwined with China, partially because we borrow so much money from them. Of course, the flip side of that is they want to lend us the money because that's what's fostering their economic growth. They have an export-driven economy, and this is one of the questions people say, well, what happens if China suddenly stops buying our debt? Well, if they stop buying our debt, that basically means they're going to stop selling us our products, which they can't do. Their workforce isn't going to let them do that if suddenly they lose their jobs. So we do have an interconnected society globally. With respect to, say, the questions in Europe, sort of a comparison between, is the United States, are we the new Greece? Are we the new Portugal in terms of, our balance is unsustainable? I think that's a little bit something we have to address too, but we're not. So we see crises that maybe take place in the periphery countries of the Eurozone, and they don't necessarily translate to what we have here in the United States as well.
Dr. Wolfram?
Well, yes, we are very intertwined with China, and that's a good thing. As has been pointed out, they're our banker, right? They got $900 billion in U.S. Treasuries. What does that mean? They're not going to do something to disrupt the value of the U.S. Treasury. They're not going to want to drive down we're a big export location for them. It would be very unsettling politically to have them try to do something to disrupt our economy, and that's a good thing. And second of all, a lot of these things, economists try to make this too difficult. This is not difficult. We don't have a trade imbalance with China, right? I trade with somebody in China, and as far as I know, they didn't buy anything from me. And I bought a flat-screen TV just the other day. Finally broke down and bought one. And so what happened? Maybe it was Chinese, and so I ran a trade imbalance with China. Is that a bad thing? That's not a. Are you running trade imbalance? Do we run trade imbalances with Ohio? You know, this idea that governments run imbalances, they don't. And on the positive, well, okay, I'm done.
Dr. Veraz.
Okay. The Chinese thing is not, I agree, it's not that much of a problem. I think that they'll support it. Although you should realize that the Chinese are limiting their exposure to our bonds, and they have been buying assets all over the world. I mean, the Chinese economy is very much penetrating into South America. They're buying oil reserves, they're buying mining, they're buying real things. And when people buy real things, that tells me that they are worried about inflation and they are worried about the value of the dollar. So I think that they're an indicator, a leading indicator. They're worried about being able to get those resources at the proper price, and they are worried about the dollar value.
Dr. Singh.
I think we all agree that China and U.S. are joined at the hip, so we are interrelated. I think we need to make fair trade with them in the sense that China has the largest industrial accidents in the world on a per capita basis, so they need to have more industrial safety, more environmental regulations, so that'll bring the cost of production up, and that'll make it more fairer. They also need to appreciate their currency, which is systematically down. But ultimately, the most scary thing about China is that the kids in China do about twice the amount of homework our Americans could do from K to 12. That is what will eat us alive.
Ouch. And my final question, beginning this time with Dr. Singh. 30 years ago, I remember when the national debt of the United States, which means the entire debt from the time that we became a country, reached $1 trillion. There was a lot of breastfeeding and wailing about that. I believe now it's 13 trillion, 14 trillion. How much is too much? Where do we reach the point where we're in an unsustainable situation? Dr. Singh.
That's a really good question. Now, before President Reagan came into the picture in 1980, the debt was less than $1 trillion. In fact, it was $920 billion. By the time President Reagan left with his tax cuts, the debt was about $2.2 trillion. So they doubled more than that. So it's not surprising that when we had tax increases by President Bush Sr. and by President Clinton, by the late 1990s, we were balancing the budget. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office was saying that we are seeing surpluses as far as the eye can see, right? Then we had the tax cuts again in 2000, and then we had a yawning deficit again. So the history is very clear in the sense that tax cuts do encourage growth to some extent, but they put a huge hole in the budget, and that creates a huge kind of problem in the long run. In terms of sustainability, we are roughly at about 60%. Our total debt is about 60% of GDP. And countries like Greece are about 120%. Japan is almost close to 200%, their total debt relative to their GDP. So we are not there yet, but if we don't control our long-term entitlements, we will get there in a few years, in 4 or 5 years.
Great.
That's why we need to solve the entitlements problem right now.
Before Dr. Veraz begins, gentlemen, again, would you please move your microphones closer to you? We're getting signals from the newsroom in New York.
Okay. Okay.
Dr. Veraz.
Yes, the debt is not as much of a problem as the interest rates are, and it's the debt service that's the problem. And the problem that I look at is what percentage of your taxes are you going to be paying in debt service? And that should really concern you, because every dollar that's spent in debt service is a dollar that cannot be spent for Social Security, for Medicare, for education, for anything else. So while we're building up this debt, now you figure, okay, if we have $15 trillion, 5% of that is $750 billion a year. So most countries, there's a new book has come out by Rogoff saying that it's different this time. And he points out that most countries get into trouble because they cannot service the debt. And that's the major problem. That was a problem with monarchist France. The Bourbon monarchy collapsed because it could not service its debt. The British had a number of problems with that. They could not service their debt. And so what I would worry about is how much debt service are we building into this budget?
Dr. Wolfram?
Yeah, it's not quite fair to say that if you cut taxes, then what happens is the deficit increase, because the revenues have all increased. If you look historically, when you cut taxes, what happens? Revenues go up. The problem is spending goes up even more. We have a $3.7 trillion spending problem is what we have. It's not a revenue shortfall. We're still bringing in over $2.5 trillion in revenue. So what is the real problem is the size of government. That's the real problem. And why do we run deficits? We run deficits because, as the other Harry pointed out, what we're doing is we want to spend more than the revenues that come in. And everybody says, this is this great, Bastiat says this government's this great fiction where we all try to steal from everybody else, right? And so that's really what's going on. Is the debt a problem? Well, it could be. The publicly held debt has never really been beyond 60% of GDP for more than 6 years. And that was the period during World War II and up to the Korean War. So we're in uncharted territory in terms of debt held by the public.
Dr. Giederman?
Yeah, there's no clear answer on how much debt is too much debt. As was pointed out earlier, different countries have different debt levels. Some are experiencing problems, but most people don't talk about, Japan has a very high debt to GDP ratio. People don't talk about Japan defaulting. I would imagine that the United States is more similar to Japan, where outside investors around the world look at the United States and say, we're not going to default, so I think they will give us a little bit more breathing room in terms of acquiring debt. I would be uncomfortable with the debt level going up above slightly more than 100% of GDP. We're certainly on that track, but that's where you start to wonder, will the outside lenders think that we're not going to be able to service our debt? It's a different concern than what say Portugal or Greece are experiencing, because we're paying our debt in our own currency as opposed to they have to pay it in euros, and so they're much more constrained than we are. So we do have more flexibility, but that's what I would think.
Great. Now I want to turn to the audience, and here are the ground rules. We're going to try this without a microphone. What I'd like you to do is raise your hand. If I call on you, please stand up, say who you are, ask your question, and indicate which panelist it's to be addressed to. If any other panelists want to respond, they'll raise their hand, and as a benevolent dictator, I'll decide whether we want to do that or not. Do not please make a speech, ask a question. So I'm wondering who, first of all, has a question for one of these gentlemen. Right up here, please. Yes. I'm going to restate the question in case someone couldn't hear it. She's asking Dr. Wolfram to comment on the concept of too big to fail and how that impacts on how these institutions are responding.
Well, certainly, too big to fail creates a situation what we call moral hazard. That is, if I know you're going to bail me out, then I'm going to take more risk than I should have. Because how do you get reward, right? The bigger the risk, the more reward. And so by making it so that these institutions are, quote, too big to fail, what does that really mean, too big to fail? It really means that the federal government has said, we're going to bail them out. And if I know you're going to bail me out, I mean, look, how many in here ever went in to their bank and when they decided whether to put money in a checking account, wanted to look at what the financials of the bank are? You don't. Why not? Because the federal government says, we'll bail you out. So you never look. And so what we've basically done is created an ad hoc guarantee for large institutions. I think that's a bad idea. And I think that this too big to fail issue, we really ought to just decide that how we're going to wind these things down. See, if you had certainty and you knew how these institutions are going to be wound down, then everybody would know. Should I invest another $100 billion in Bank of America? Well, if it goes belly up, then here's what's going to happen. Here's going to get stuff back. So I think rather than bailing these institutions out, we ought to have a clear bankruptcy law that says, hey, this is how it's going to get wound down, and then you guys can decide if you want to put your money in there or not.
Dr. Wolfram, out of curiosity, I'm wondering, do you think the government should have taken that approach with General Motors?
Oh, yeah.
They should have been allowed to go out of business.
I think what we should have, see, the problem with General Motors going down is nobody knew what would happen. And so I didn't know if the part suppliers were going to go down. I didn't know it. And look how it went down. How it went down was the government decided, well, we're gonna take the unions over the secured creditors. So now I really don't know what the rules are. And so you create even more uncertainty.
Dr. Singh, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, one of the books I would recommend is Too Big to Fail by Andrew Ross Sorkin. It reads like a mystery thriller, and it's very good reading. But one of the surprising things about this financial crisis is that the banks have become actually stronger after the crisis. So the four large financial banks and investment houses, they are 60% of GDP. 60% of GDP means about $8 trillion. That means on average, it's about $2 trillion per bank. So that is definitely too big to fail. I mean, those are huge even now.
Who else has a question? Gentlemen.
My name is Joe Walker, and my question is to Dr. Verizon. And my question is this, Doctor. Do you see the common person, the ordinary person who pays into Social Security, as a person who is looking at it as an entitlement that can be reduced, or do you see it as an insurance policy that a person has paid his premiums or her premiums on, and if so, what's the basis for your conjecture or conclusion on that?
Okay. Well, I would take the basis that what is more important is how the government looks at it rather than how I do. The Supreme Court has ruled that there is no entitlement or insurance in Social Security. The Supreme Court has ruled that the government can change that at any time that they so desire. So, I mean, what my opinion would be is not going to change it. But what there is it can change it. I think that most people, when it was sold to them, they had the implicit understanding that it was something like an insurance policy. As the politicians sold it to the American people. And in a sense, in a way, in that sense, it's an implied contract. But it is not, it is maybe verbally that way between us, or an understanding that we thought this was a contract, but the government does not look at it that way.
Does anyone else wish to respond to that?
Well, look, Social Security is what? It's taking from those people that are less than 65 and giving it to those people that are over 65, who I used to call old until I got close to that. So I refrain from using that with my students. But, I mean, that's what it is. And so what happens is you just hope that they're going to steal from the other younger people once you turn 65. I mean, that's how it's always been. Your money's never been somehow invested. Your money goes into what they call government accounting securities, which are non-marketable. There's really no trust fund out there. They're just IOUs that the Treasury says it's going to pay the Social Security Administration money when it gets there. And so it really isn't a system of insurance. In fact, there was an amendment at the time when the Social Security Act was passed in the Senate that would have made it your own account. And that amendment was defeated. So it's pretty clear. It's just a matter, it's an income transfer program.
That's why I said the problem is demographics. There's not enough young people there paying in. And this is going to be, you can say, I guess they call it a Ponzi scheme. That's what it is. There's just not enough young people.
As a 59-year-old, I'd like to encourage all of you to have many children. This gentleman right here.
My name is Jim Fallon. Question for Dr. Singh. Do you believe that means testing with Social Security would make any impact into it? So if I'm successful and I have millions of dollars, maybe I don't need that insurance policy coming back to me. But and it's not just old people. What if someone is injured in some accident and they're not able to work? Social Security is an insurance policy. In that case, if I get killed, my wife gets my Social Security. So means testing.
Well, that's right. Social Security is not only a retirement program, it's also for disability, and it's also for dependent children who lose their parents. So they get at least a livable income until they're 18. So those are two very important components of Social Security. Social Security can be fixed quite easily, like I said, with 3 or 4 things at the margin. We don't have to make it means testing, because means testing is a slippery slope, and people who have paid into it, at least deserve some payments out of it. If you want to make it means testing in terms of very high incomes, that's not going to fetch much dividends anyway. So I'm not really in favor of trying to do means testing. But this whole idea of trying to privatize Social Security, think if Social Security funds had been in the stock market, in 2007 and 2008, they'd have gone down by about 60 or 70%. So I think everyone should have a skeptical view about Social Security in the sense that don't rely totally on Social Security, especially for the younger guys. It might be around, but the benefits will be much more reduced. So you have to do your private 403B savings and stuff like that too. But it's basically a diversification program in the sense that you need other kinds of retirement income too. And Social Security should be just one component of it. Don't just rely on Social Security.
I'd like to ask each of the panels, starting with you, Dr. Singh, to comment on, should we then, at some point, Social Security, I forget the current figure, but you don't pay it and income's over a certain amount. I forget whether it's 90,000, 100,000. Should we just take the cap off and say people should pay Social Security on what taxes on whatever they make, Dr. Singh?
Well, my calculations are showing the current limit is about 106,000, by the way, or 108, something like that. So if you raise the cap to about 150, something like that, and you reduce the benefits in terms of future growth by about 2%, and you raise the retirement age slowly, very slowly, over like 60, 70 years to about 70, 71, that solves the problem.
I think he just said that we're all going to pay more and never be allowed to retire. But Dr. Verizon?
Something has to give, right?
I think part of Social Security reform, I know it's going to be very controversial, is I don't think you can go to young people and say, hey, pay into the system, and guess what? When you get to this age, we're going to move the goal line. So I think if you're going to say that to young people, I think you've got to give them the option of having their own plan. Now, I'm not an expert on Social Security to know how that particular thing would work, but I can tell you that in Chile, the transfers of Social Security into the private system has worked marvelously. And I think that if you're going to go to someone, you're going to say, okay, we're going to guarantee you at 65, we're going to guarantee you at this, that's one thing. But if you say, pay into the system, and by the way, when you get there, guess what? You got another 4 years to wait, or you got another 10 years to wait. So I would not be for any Social Security reform that would not include some kind of voluntary option for the younger people.
Dr. Wolfram?
Well, I would make two changes. One is, I was Nick Smith's chief of staff in 95, 96, who's congressman from Michigan 7th, and one of the things that he really worked on was Social Security reform, because he realized the longer you wait, the demographics work against you. But you can do an awful lot by increasing the retirement age. When Social Security went in 1935, and you were retiring at 65, the life expectancy for males was 63. So it was supposed to keep you for 20 years. Second is, I think we ought to means test the thing. Let's just admit it's a transfer program. And why in the world am I taxing some bus driver making $30,000 a year to give give Warren Buffett money? That doesn't make sense to me. Third is, my main reform is that instead of you're getting your Social Security check, you get a list of your neighbors and how much they owe in Social Security, and you have to go door to door and collect it from them. And you have to say, Harry, you owe me $50.75, right? Because that's what we do. And if we did it that way, I think people would start to look at the Social Security system entirely differently.
He doesn't live in my neighborhood in Detroit. Dr. Giedemann?
Let me start by saying that according to the CBO, the Social Security Trust Fund is supposed to expire and benefits will be cut the year I'm eligible for full Social Security benefits. So let me start by saying that. One of the things I'm a little bit concerned about privatization is there is we've heard the term moral hazard, but there's also a moral hazard in this. If we let people invest in things, privately, well, what's going to happen? Well, I'm going to choose to invest purely in growth stuff because I don't care about the risk, because what's going to happen is when I retire, if I succeed, great, I get this great sum of money. If I lose and my portfolio is worthless, you're not going to let me die. That's just not going to be the way it happens in society. All right, well, one person, thank you for not letting me die.
I might.
But this is what's going to happen is we as a society we're not going to let that happen to older people, and something's going to give. So you set up this moral hazard problem where if you let things get put into private accounts, this can happen. The other thing we have to be a little concerned, if we let people put things into private accounts, that's going to have an effect on the stock market right now, which would basically cause a wealth transfer to people who own stocks right now. There has to be some sort of way to address this wealth transfer if you would want to do it this way. But I think things can be addressed. I think Gary's right. There's going to have to be an increase in retirement age to some extent. You don't have to do it today. If somebody's 66 years old today, you don't have to say, hey, sorry, you retired last month. You have to work 4 more years. But you can phase it in, a month per year until it's appropriate. So,
The person who clapped was Dr. Giedemann's mother. I'm going to now interject another question of my own to bring this back more to the scope of the program. I want to ask all the panelists, beginning with Dr. Giedemann, was the decision by the European countries to go to a common currency, the euro, a good thing for the world, and how has that impacted the United States of America?
Let me start by saying, was it a good thing for Europe? And it's not clear economically. I don't think the Eurozone was ever intended, at least the people who started it, they were not economists. It did not start for any really strong economic reasoning. Yes, it reduces transaction costs a little bit. Yes, it can foster a little bit of trade, but basically it was a political decision that they wanted to make Europe stronger, somewhat as a counterbalance to the United States, but also just to make Europe work better. And the Germans wanted to do it because the Germans, sort of wanted to convince the rest of the Europeans, hey, we're not going to attack you again. And the French were winning because they thought they were better diplomats than the Germans, and they thought they could control things this way. So but economically, it doesn't seem like it's worked out that well. And one of the things that you have is once you have these Eurozone, the nations jumped in. And for example, like Greece and Italy, when they jumped in, suddenly they had the credible commitment of basically the Bundesbank that they weren't going to have inflation. This worked out very well. They could borrow money at very low cost. And there was something called the Stability and Growth Pact, where basically it was supposed to limit the Europeans' government's ability to spend too much money and go into debt, because there was, again, a moral hazard problem that they would have to get bailed out by the richer nations. Well, nobody sort of followed that. And so now you have sort of the problem if you have, if you're in the Eurozone, Portugal, the only way they're going to be able to recover, since they can't, inflation is one way to actually help you recover, and since they can't do that, they're going to face a long period of declines. Greece the same way, and these very strong adjustments. So it's not clear it was necessarily a great thing for the European nations. For the United States, I don't know if it's had any great impact on us.
Good. Dr. Wolfram, what do you think?
Well, there's a graft of economics literature, sort of technical literature on optimal currency zones. But one of the real problems they have is they have different fiscal policies. And so when, in the old days, if Greece ran into a debt problem, they just deflate their currency. I mean, that's what we're going to do. I mean, that's how we're going to get rid of our debt, is we're going to deflate the currency. And so, but they can't do that. They can't just go ahead and start printing out, I don't even know what Greece would have used. Drachmas? Is that what? Drachmas. Yeah. So they can't do that. So now they're sort of stuck. Now they've got their real burden of their debt is too high for them to sustain. So if all the economies and all the fiscal policies were similar, then they might have got away with it. But this disparate fiscal policy and disparate economic strength has created a problem where now you got the Germans. Now they have a political problem. Are they going to bail out Greece? Are they going to bail out Portugal? What about Spain? So politically, that's going to be hard for them to do. I think it's a real problem for them.
Dr. Verizor, and add Dr. Verizor, do you think this system will still have euros in 20 years?
Yes, I do. I think the euro was good for Europe. I agree with Dr. Giedemann on that. What it does is it just says there's no country in Europe has a monetary policy. Okay, it's like the states in the Union. Okay, no state has a monetary policy. So if you can't print money, there's no monetary policy. So what's happened is the Europeans decided to hand over their currency to the Germans. And the Germans, when it comes to monetary policy, are tighter than 9 is to 10. And the reason is they went through an inflation twice in their history, and they do not want to see it. So from that standpoint, now from the standpoint of being able to raise money, obviously the European countries are much more able, like Greece could never sell bonds in drachmas. Nobody's going to buy that because they said, well, you just print them up in the basement and give them to us and it'll be worthless. So it does allow the European countries to borrow money in euros, which allows them to borrow it at much lower interest rates. The other thing, it does help the European internal economies in that you don't have the problem with currency exchanges. And so you don't have, in a sense, a currency overhang or a currency risk on your balance sheets. You don't have to worry about, okay, if we have drachmas, what are they worth today, or francs, what are they worth today? Everybody knows what the euro, at least within that, what the euro is going to be worth.
Dr. Singh.
The total amount of output produced by the Eurozone is roughly the amount we produce. So it's really a strong competitor in terms of the amount of GDP. I agree with all the panelists in the sense that the basic contradiction in the Eurozone is the fact that monetary policy was centralized, so they had a single currency, but fiscal policy was very different. And fiscal policy being different in France and Germany is one thing, but fiscal policy difference in places like Greece or Spain or Ireland, where they were quite reckless in terms of building up their budget deficits, then creates this kind of structural problem whereby countries like France and Germany have to bail them out for the fact that they were reckless in terms of their spending. And in some cases like Greece, they actually more or less lied about their budget deficits for a while. So it does create a problem, but in the long run, it's still going to survive.
Who has another question? Sir.
Yeah, I'm not sure who wants to take this exactly, but my name is Dave Bushwick, by the way. Yeah. So, we've heard the term moral hazard a couple times tonight in different references. What kind of moral hazard did we create by not prosecuting anybody? The only person that's gone to jail is Bernie Madoff. I don't think Bernie Madoff is responsible for the global financial crisis.
By not prosecuting whom? I'm sorry.
People in Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, AIG, Matt Taibbi has done quite a bit of reporting on this.
Okay, so who wants to take the question of should we have prosecuted more of the abusers in the financial crisis?
I'm not
Dr. Singh?
Now, well, I think one of the larger questions is that the losses in these banks were socialized, so we paid for all the losses, but the gains have been privatized. So I'm not too crazy about sending one or two guys to prison, you know. I'm not sure that solves the moral hazard, but what does solve the moral hazard to some extent is that if we, the taxpayers, bail them out, and I agree we should have bailed them out because at that time if we didn't bail them out, the whole thing would have collapsed. But since we have bailed them out and now they are much more stronger, they should have paid back, you know, in terms of at least part of the budget deficit somehow in terms of a transaction tax or something like that, so that at least the gains were socialized to some extent too, not only the losses.
Dr. Giederman.
Yeah, it's not exactly clear what they did that was illegal. I mean, there certainly could be things that you might think, well, these were, I'm sorry? That doesn't mean it was illegal to take our money. We gave it to them. And so one of the things, this is my point though, is, you know, we should have been able as a nation to look and say, wait a minute, they can do these things. We don't want them to do these things. So we put regulations in place. So this is what I'm getting at is maybe they didn't do anything technically illegal, but that's because we failed on a regulatory sense to actually go in and say, wait a minute, they can cause these problems. We need to put something in place that's going to limit their ability to do this. So they do face some sort of potential fear or discouragement from undertaking these actions. So
Dr. Wolfram and then Dr. Vreiser, do we need more regulation?
We don't need more regulation. I think regulation caused part of the problem. What was the problem? The question is, do you need the right kind of regulation? I mean, you can regulate all you want, and you can cause much more problems with the regulation than if you didn't regulate at all. So the question is, what kind of regulation do we need? That's the real question. And what the kind of regulation that you need is so you don't have fraud. I mean, if people are committing fraud, that's a problem. People need, as long, you know, I trust that everyone in this room probably has a pretty good idea of how they want to live their life and what decisions they want to make. And I certainly don't think that somebody on the Federal Reserve Board can figure out what you want to do or what kind of mortgage you should take or any of that. And so what really happened was you have this interaction of the political system with the system so that Goldman gets what? Goldman gets, because we bail out AIG, and Goldman gets 100% on the dollar. You know, why does that happen? Well, because if you look at who's in Treasury and you look at who's making the decisions in that room, I mean, they're Goldman people. And so you really have to, actually, say Rolling Stone magazine actually has a pretty good piece on that. And so it's really this interaction where you let the government be able to do all sorts of things, and then you wonder why people who are making millions and millions of dollars, they're the one in the room and you're not. So I think we ought to make it so that not many things are done in the room, so you don't have to worry about who's in.
Dr. Vreiser?
Yeah, I think the regulation they need is to regulate the supply of money and link that to an external discipline like we did under Bretton Woods. This is the second time this has happened. In the 1930s, we had exactly the same thing. The Federal Reserve Board was expanding the currency at 3 times the rate of the gold supply. They deliberately inflated the amount of credit. And if you take a look, what happened? You had all kinds of crooks or kinds of irregularities that appeared. You had the insult scandal. You had a number of scandals that came up. Whenever you start printing money, whenever you start creating credit, you start creating all kinds of other problems, and one of them is crooks. And the problem is that they're all talking about regulation. This regulation is not going to work because you're not getting to the problem. You have to discipline the money supply to some external factor. You can't continue to print money. Now, Greenspan said in his book, it's in The Age of Turbulence. I don't quite remember the exact page, around 236. He said, oh, we decided to lower the interest rate by creating credit, and we knew there was going to be a bubble. I mean, he admitted he knew it was going to happen. And why? Because he had the ability to change the value of the dollar, and he had the ability to change interest rates by increasing the money supply. That to me is the genesis of the problem.
Who's next? Who else has a question? Sir.
What about all these up-and-coming countries?
But say who you are and who you're addressing the
Jeff
question to.
Darling from Grand Rapids Community College. And you've got India, you've got the Middle East, where there is a much wider spread of young people, and they're coming up, and their shadow is looming pretty good on our economy. How do you think that's going to affect us in the future?
Dr. Singh, why don't you take that?
Well, two separate problems. In the last 10 years, I will say it openly, but some people will not. In the last 10 years, power has been shifting towards Asia, towards India, China, also the BRIC countries like Brazil and Russia. So the main issue is that our skills, in terms of labor market, we really need to develop our skills better so that we're able to get the higher skill jobs, because the lower skill jobs are already moving to these countries, call centers and things like that. So the real kind of challenge, I think, is to make sure that at least our K-12 system, in terms of high school and stuff like that, have really strong skills. I mean, the universities are doing a fairly good job, but somehow in terms of the K-12 system, in some levels it's broken down, and we need to reform that. But the stuff in Middle East is a little bit different. There's a lot of persons who are under 30. In fact, in most of the countries where you see all this turmoil going on, there's 30% of the population under 30. And my hope is that when they ask for democracy and things like that, they basically don't get brainwashed into some kind of crazy religion, and they actually look for economic reform so that they can better their lot. So that's going to take a long time in the Middle East to happen, because they don't have the institutional structures in terms of different kinds of banking systems and other kinds of things to develop economically. But that's their challenge.
Does anyone want to add anything substantially different?
Well, I think on the K-12 system is a real problem. I think it's great that these countries are moving towards market economies and producing things. There's going to be more stuff in the world, right? I can't be worse off if 1.3 billion Chinese can now produce, and that we're under a system where they couldn't be very productive. There's more stuff. So I think it's great. It's great that India's doing that. But we'd really have to deal with the institutional structure of the K-12 program. And let me give you a brief look. See this thing, this thing, you could launch the space shuttle with this thing if you were my 15-year-old son. I mean, I can't really operate the whole thing. But, the market produces this thing, and then you're going to tell me that we can't teach a fourth grader to read in the city of Detroit, okay? We can. It's just that the K-12 system produces goods and that educational services in a different fashion than we produce these things. And when we can transition that to the same system that makes these, then we'll be okay.
This gentleman here. You, yes.
My name is Tyler, and my question is for Dr. Wolf. You mentioned earlier that, some people are talking about increasing the taxes to manage the debt. You say that lower taxes help encourage growth in the economic center and produce more things. But my question is, at the same time, we can't afford the programs that we already have, Social Security and healthcare, and you mentioned education. Those are all important things. How do you balance that, is what I'm wondering.
Well, the question is, how do you balance these needs for health care and education, et cetera? And what you have, the systems where you really have problems are what? Health care and K-12 education. I mean, that's really where people have problems. And what's the problem? They're structurally different than the rest of how we make stuff. They're both more government central planned interaction. And I think it's a structural problem. The healthcare costs are being driven by what? It's being driven by the same thing that happens when you take somebody out to dinner, right? When you take somebody out to dinner, when do you tell them you're going to pick up the check? After you order, right? After you order. Now, the problem in healthcare is they know you're picking up the check. And so what do you see? You see an ad for the scooter. No, never what the price of the scooter is. It's just that Medicare is going to pay for it. So what's my incentive? My incentive is to make $1 million scooter, right? And so you wonder why healthcare costs are so high. Because we're spending all these resources to do what? To go into whatever the government will politically pay for. So you need to change the structure. And if you change the structures, then we won't have to have all these expenditures in Medicare and Medicaid and K-12.
Can I interject? It's not entirely true that healthcare problems are because of the government sector. Medicare is a fairly efficient run program. The administrative cost of Medicare is 1/2 of 1%. The gatekeeping administrative costs of private insurance companies are sometimes 30%. They spend 30% of their revenue sometimes trying to cherry pick and deny different kinds of conditions. And that's all in the private sector, by the way. So it's not very clear that it's the public sector which is causing all these problems in healthcare.
Well, but if I may just interact. Yeah, the point is not that health insurance companies have higher administrative costs. They probably will. The problem is everybody has wrong incentives here. You have so much government intervention in the healthcare structure that everybody's got the wrong incentives, and it's incentives that make this thing work out.
If you're saying that there's wrong incentives in the fact that people are demanding too much, they're demanding a scooter and stuff, then you increase the deductible so that you get part of the pain in terms of spending that money, and then the demand will go down. But the question is to...
We've all been taken out to dinner and didn't even get a good night kiss out of it. I would like to ask, finally, I'd like to ask all of our panelists to tell us, in a minute or less if they can, what in the global financial crisis, what are they most frightened of? What are you most worried about in the out years, in the years foreseeable ahead, starting with Dr. Singh?
Well, my main fear is that if we don't control entitlements in the next 5 years or so, we will kind of come close to like Greece or Spain, and there'll be a run on the dollar. That means our national solvency in terms of our ability to pay the debt will be questioned.
Dr. Barad.
Yes, my worry is the rise of protectionism. That's contributed very, very heavily to the depths of the Depression with the Smoot-Hawley tariff. I would be scared to death of another rise of protectionism. I think the world is way, way too much intertwined to allow that to happen. But but there are some signs on the horizon that protectionist impulses are there. And so I'm very much worried about that because that tends to destroy the international division of labor.
What do you see that most happening with an attempt to renegotiate NAFTA?
I think the problem is with the currency changes. Remember, a currency change has a tariff effect. So we can say, well, we have free trade with Canada, but all of a sudden we say to the Canadians, well, guess what? The American dollar is worth 50 cents less. Suddenly, now what happens? Canadian goods are worth a lot more. So I'm worried about them because they're tied very closely together. And my worry is that if that were to happen, the interdependency between the nations would break down, and that a lot of goods and services would become an awful lot more expensive all over the world. We could lead to wars. I hope that wouldn't happen, but that's my worry.
Well, my worry is that we're going to keep the K-12 education system the way it is, and we're going to have City of Detroit's public school system is going to look like it does, and the problem is the low wage labor manufacturing jobs are not in the United States. And as the rest of the world begins to move to market-based economies, it's going to be harder and harder for us to compete in the manufacturing and the labor side. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have to use your intellect and sell all sorts of things which are services. Like somebody's going to have to manage the legal case for somebody that defaults on a contract in North Korea or in South Korea or something. So the only way we can do that is to increase human capital, and the only way, the best way to increase human capital is to have a really strong K-12 education system, and that can only happen if we move the structure away from what it is. I mean, I really worry about the kids that are going through Detroit public schools, and I mean, just one quick one. Ask yourself when the last time you ever heard anyone say, gee, I want to move to Detroit so I can send my kids to school there, or Chicago, or Cleveland, or Baltimore, or Philadelphia, or any major city. We know you don't do that, and we have to address that problem.
I will say one thing about public schooling. There are certain problems, but I have heard people say, hey, I want to move to East Grand Rapids. I want to move to Forest Hill so my kids can go to a good public education. So that's something that the public education doesn't always fail. The thing that scares me the most is that it seems like there's been a reduction in the possibility of sort of reasonable debate among people who have differences in opinions on what should be done. For example, it's interesting, both Harry and Gary mentioned, with respect to entitlements, with Medicare, maybe there has to be some sort of cost sharing or even reductions in expenses. If anybody outside this room, if either one of these were running for political office, somebody's going to post the next day, it's a death panel. It's a death panel. And they're trying to make reasonable discussions on what needs to be done. In the political climate, people don't seem to care about that. And that's the thing that worries me most of all is I think our problems are fixable. I think, I'm... Sorry.
On that note, now that we've agreed on the way to fix everything, I'm turning things back over to Vicki Ludeman.